Welcome everyone to the Exploding the Myth, a workshop in which we will take a closer look at the World Bank Group's gas finance. I'm Maria Postakova. I will be moderating the workshop. I'm a senior policy advisor at E3G, the independent climate change think tank, where I had work on energy diplomacy and covering topic ranging from broader geopolitics of energy transition to international energy finance. We have an excellent outline of speakers today, whom I will present in a minute, who will help us to provide an overview of World Bank's investment and what role fossil fuel finance has in banks' activities, as well as discuss with us the lessons learned out of World Bank's gas financing with somewhat really on-the-ground impacts from recipient countries. After the inputs and presentations, we'll have some time for questions and hope to have an in-depth discussion with all of you on what both the shifting global landscape and the global climate agenda mean for the future of World Bank's energy finance and the role of gas in it. Before we kick off with presentations, maybe a couple of words about the moment in which this workshop is now taking place. I'm sure you all have been following the news, and you know that we are now living in a time of truly tectonic shifts in both geopolitical, economic, and energy landscape. And Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine has put the overall global order and the now inherently interconnected global economy, and meanwhile, global energy markets under extreme strain. And the energy price crisis that has been ongoing, in fact, before the war, since the last year, and is now being exacerbated by the impacts of Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine. And now the looming food and financial crisis endanger not only the recovery efforts of the countries that are slowly emerging from COVID, but and most in the developing world still are in the midst of their COVID response. The current situation poses a real challenge to the country's efforts to transition away from fossil fuel-based economies and to achieve the net zero goals that so many countries have put on the table in the recent years. We see that the EU may be dealing with the direct political interface of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the crisis it represents fairly well, despite many challenges, but the economic repercussions of the crisis, particularly for gas importers elsewhere, notably in the developing world, are much more severe. And as food and fuel prices rise, the ability of many countries to respond is really constrained by the need to service external debt. Global debt levels have risen to a new high, more than 50% higher total borrowing value than in the pre-pandemic times. And now we see that in the short term, these countries are forced to choose between allocating the budgets for health or education and for warm homes or production of goods. And as many of these countries will seek now support from international institutions, they really need to break with this old paradigms of real focus on fossil fuel finance and adapt their advice to these new energy realities. And in these realities that we see gas that has been perceived as the transition fuel by many has a wholly different role to play now. It is one of the economic liability and a security risk. And while Europe is scrambling for alternative supplies of LNG, developing countries have to cut their demand of LNG as they can't really afford to keep up with the rising market prices. And many countries are now rolling back on fossil fuel subsidy, phase out plans to cushion the shocks. We also see that in this really drastic times, many countries, including the countries of the global south, are fundamentally rethinking their approach to how they consume energy and to what role energy transition actually plays in the future of their economies. In this sense, the whole notion of energy security is now being rethought away from reliance on fossil fuel supply, which is now really an economic and political liability, and towards the security of new energy supply and security of energy demand, with a whole new focus on energy efficiency measures and energy systems flexibility. So there is a real need for alternative solutions, and there is a real need for institutions that can enable these alternative solutions. And there, all eyes are really turning to multilateral development banks that have traditionally been the go-to lenders for developing countries in crisis situations. They always had the strategic role in empowering the energy transition in the global south. However, the MDBs and the World Bank Group in particular are still playing only a minor role in supporting countries in achieving their climate goals, despite the fact that they represent the most effective way to deliver and multiply the capital contributions that shareholders make. So now maybe we will take a closer look at what the financing of the World Bank Group has affected in the countries on the ground, in the recipient countries, in the presentations that will now follow. And after that, it would be great to discuss with the panelists, but also with the participants, what needs to shift in World Bank's approach to energy finance, what needs to shift in its energy policies, and its overall approach, not just to the recipient countries, but also to communities on the ground that are delivering these lessons learned. Before going to the presentations, I would like to remark that we, in fact, attempted to win a speaker from the World Bank to speak at today's presentation, and World Bank couldn't provide a speaker to be here today, which we note, of course, with a regret, because in such challenging and turbulent times where really so many shifts are happening, and all eyes are really on how the international institutions tackle this crisis and how they respond in their support to recipient crisis. We really need to have this conversation with the staff of the World Bank and really to move this agenda forward. So we of course regret the decision of World Bank not to participate directly in this webinar, but very much hope that the outcomes of the discussion and outcomes of the presentation can be forwarded to the World Bank staff, and then we can really move the clean energy agenda forward within the World Bank group. Without further ado, I would like to present the first speaker to you. It's Broman Tucker. She is the Global Public Finance Co-Manager at All Change International, and she focuses on shifting public finance and subsidies towards a fair and 100% renewable future. Previously, Broman worked towards Indigenous rights and a just transition away from the tar sands in Alberta, and as a campaigner with the Council of Canadians and Greenpeace Canada. Her academic work has focused on evaluating climate and energy policies for their impacts on equity and mitigation and on social movement theory. Broman will present us with some really crunchy data on how the World Bank Group finance in energy looks like, what role gas plays, and what this all means for the future of energy transition. Broman, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Maria. I thought sharing my slides went too well, so it's fair that I couldn't find the unmute button. Yeah, thanks everyone for being here today. I'm really going to just focus on some of the kind of trends in what the World Bank's energy lending has looked like, and also we'll kind of zero in a little bit on gas and kind of what this means they should be doing around policy. But I think what will be, I think, more exciting is also hearing, some of those really specific examples and in specific contexts, kind of like the impacts that this has had. So the data that I'm, just a second. Great. The data that I'm sharing today is from a database that OCI has hosted for almost a decade now, but we'll actually be relaunching it publicly next week. And so prior to this, you had to email me to get this data. And so I'm really excited that it'll be up and a lot more accessible. And so this data set covers the World Bank and the other major multilateral development banks, but then also G20 development finance institutions, as well as G20 export credit agencies. And so this will be launching and available April 20th. But yeah, on the World Bank specifically, we pretty consistently find of the kind of major MDBs that the World Bank is the highest for fossil fuel finance. And so they're at the top of this graph, and looking a little bit at kind of like what's behind these numbers as well. This is what is easiest to capture is kind of direct project finance. And so where possible to specify, we do include development policy finance and financial intermediaries. But of course, lots of this is not possible to kind of disaggregate enough to include. And so definitely an underestimate here for the World Bank, and then also for the other MDBs. And then, yeah, as you can see, kind of gas is a really is the majority share of the kind of fossil fuel finance here. We also have a measure of whether a project is aimed at improving energy access, and for fossil fuels, less than 10% of this at the World Bank in this kind of last 3-year period had this as a kind of an aim in the project, or a core aim. Yeah, and so definitely, you know, putting this into context of everything we're seeing right now, obviously, the International Energy Agency has been very clear that past 2021, we should not, you know, to be aligned with a 1.5 degree scenario. There's no new upstream oil and gas approvals, that there's not room for LNG expansion, and that you know, across the IEA's models as well as the IPCC and other civil society studies before this, they all find this like similar rapid phase out being needed for fossil fuels, really in the next decade, you know, along the next decade, really having 3 to 4% a drop per year in terms of gas, and 11% per year for coal. And so for a public bank, you know, really with sustainable development and climate change as core goals, we're at the point where private finance, we can't afford for private finance to be expanding fossil fuel infrastructure any longer. And so for a kind of publicly backed bank like the World Bank, this is especially egregious because we need these public banks to be acting as catalysts for the energy transition. And yeah, just to dig in a little bit or show some different angles, this is where we can see some World Bank policy coming into play. And so there is in the 2016, the World Bank agreed to phase out upstream oil and gas support for extraction, and we are seeing, at least in terms of direct policy finance, we can see obviously a bit of like this decline in the last 3 years is very welcome. And then at the same time, knowing the science that I just laid out, that it's still for a public bank that we really, you know, they're still far above other MDBs, and that at this point we really need public banks to be leading the way, fully excluding fossil fuels and really focusing on the kind of just energy transition. Yeah, to look at kind of the other buckets of energy spending here. This is World Bank is second on this graph, and here I think just you know, looking at the kind of clean energy line, and knowing that, you know, almost half of it is like fully outweighed by the fossil fuel finance, I think also speaks to this, just like really not orienting to the scale of transition that's needed, because we're in a time where our energy models are calling for exponential growth in clean energy support. And again, public banks have a really specific catalytic role to play here. And so, yeah, I think just, you know, obviously helpful, or like it is, we would want the clean energy to be much higher in this graph, and then obviously for this, like for a full fossil fuel exclusion to be put in place. And then, yeah, just a little bit in terms of like where this goes. I think, as I said, you know, you can see this exclusion of upstream oil and gas come into play. And yeah, just between, at least this is just for the last 3 years, where the kind of project mix went in terms of stages. Yeah, and then as I kind of said, you know, this is what we're able to track. And so there's both through financial intermediaries and development policy financing, there's also, I think, often really systemic recommendations and changes that are suggested by the World Bank. And so I think it's really important to not just look at the kind of direct policy finance, but also the you know, the policy recommendations that are getting put to specific countries and built into specific country plans. There's a link to this. This is from a joint submission and that's hosted on the Eurodad website. And I think the URL is just cut off in the view below, but I'll share the link in the chat. yeah, I think just to end, I think looking at these trends really just there's a number of areas and policy opportunities coming up where the World Bank can definitely easily make shifts. And so the climate change action plan that was released last year still allows for gas, and the regulations around how they will continue to finance gas is quite unclear, especially compared to other kind of recent MDB policies. And so there's further review there that it has been promised, and I think they're both really cracking down on loopholes for gas and being clear about and with a lot more clarity is really needed. There's just transition support for coal that has been promised, but I think extending that to oil and gas and also making sure that that's really supporting workers and communities is really needed. And then, I'll also just, on the kind of energy access strategy, we're still definitely, I think that kind of just transition support and energy access support on the renewable side is probably where we need clean energy finance the most urgently. And then we'll lastly just say, in terms of transparency and civil society engagement, that kind of this pattern of the not having a World Bank speaker for today, I think also links into recent kind of trends from the World Bank on climate that we saw really pop up at COP26 in specific. And so I think if there's time in the discussion as well to cover that, that would be helpful. And I think there's just I think we are seeing a trend between the kind of worsening civil society engagement and then also the policy outcomes that we're actually that we're getting. And so I think there's just a real opportunity for the World Bank to engage meaningfully with civil society, and that will actually lead to really strong outcomes on climate, but then also gender and workers' rights and issues across the board. So thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks a lot, Bronwyn, for this overview. That was excellent. Maybe before jumping on to the next speaker, just because this was so insightful, I wanted to maybe ask you quickly about the fact that World Bank is not among the multilateral development banks that have signed on onto the Glasgow Finance Statement to shift international public finance from fossil fuels to clean energy. Could you maybe quickly comment on this? I find it a bit perplexing, to be honest, because most of the shareholders that are shareholders of the World Bank have signed on the statement. So what's going on there?
Thanks. And I actually had a slide on this that I didn't get to. At COP26, we saw 39 countries and institutions commit to phase out their fossil fuel finance by the end of 2022. And also alongside that, which I think is very, very important to get right, is to fully prioritize clean energy instead. And I think we need to see that finance shift, but also much more to go to clean energy and the transition to have strong development outcomes. But we are seeing 44% of World Bank Group shareholders, and that's based on IBRD shares, are signatories to this statement. And we're also still seeing those numbers grow and new members join. And so I think there really is we saw the World Bank be one of the first major public banks to put any restrictions on oil and gas finance in 2016. And the MDBs were one of the first groups of institutions to commit to Paris alignment. And we're now seeing a ton of really slow, bogged down processes over the last few years where there hasn't then been continued leadership. And I think just this Glasgow statement is a really strong example of that, where we're seeing other public finance institutions and governments step in and do what is needed, and seeing the World Bank really fall behind and kind of lose that leadership mantle, at least on the energy side.
Many thanks, Bronwyn. There is already a question for you in the chat, but George, if you allow, I will we'll put it off for after all the presentations, where we can have a discussion with all the speakers. But don't worry, your question will be definitely raised. I'm very excited to present you the next speaker, particularly because she will be covering the case of Pakistan and gas. And as probably some of you have been following, Pakistan is among the countries that are really now suffering because of the high LNG prices, and they are basically forced to opt out of their imports of LNG while they're really dependent on these gas imports, just because the prices on the spot market are prohibitively high for these countries. And while European market and the developed Asian countries can afford this, countries such as Pakistan cannot. I would now hand over to Hanira, who is a research associate at energy finance analyst at Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis. Hanira is a graduate of Yale School of the Environment and covers Asian energy markets at this institute. She specializes in energy policy and economics and has been involved in campaigning for a cleaner energy transition in Pakistan for advocacy and research. Very much looking forward to your remarks, Hanira. Go ahead, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Maria. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, okay. All right, thank you for inviting me to this webinar and for having this discussion, basically, especially we've seen how in recent times the invasion of Ukraine by Russia has affected energy supply markets throughout the world, not just European markets, but Asian markets, as well as LNG supplies have been diverted towards more affluent economies, and emerging economies like Pakistan and Bangladesh have been left out of the mix. So I'm just going to be speaking about the Pakistani case and how it has been impacted by more reliance on imported fuels such as LNG. So when we talk about Pakistan, I think it is safe to say that Pakistan is a classic example of how over-reliance on imported fuels can hurt the economy. It used to be furnace oil at first, but now we see that it is increasingly shifted towards imported gas. And this has really exacerbated the energy and economic woes of the country. And to some extent, these oil and gas investments have been facilitated by multilateral development banks like ADB and the World Bank. For example, the first LNG terminal in the country, the Engro LNG terminal, was developed with funding from both IFC and ADB. ADB provided almost $30 million in loan assistance, while IFC provided about $15 million in equity and a $20 million loan as well. Then ADB has been heavily involved with gas pipeline projects in the country as well. The Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Indian pipeline project, the Tapi gas pipeline project, which is currently under dispute due to financial issues and geopolitical constraints. For that, ADB was acting as a transaction advisor and a major lender as well. ADB has a gas storage project as well, for which it is providing the country technical assistance, and it has invested in numerous gas power plants and a coal power plant in the country as well. So we can see that MDBs do have a role to play in steering the energy direction of a country towards certain fuel mixes to an extent. And it is understandable that these MDBs have responded to the needs of their member countries. And once these investments may have made sense, for example, in the case of Pakistan, the shift towards gas was made because imported fuel was really having a huge economic impact on the GDP of the country. And it was like a huge economic burden on the country. So they shifted towards gas, and the MDBs assisted with that. But especially, but right now we can see that these in the longer run, these investments may not be feasible anymore, mainly because these investments have locked in fossil fuel infrastructure, and we can see that this infrastructure is facing economic risks of getting stranded, and is having wider macroeconomic impacts on different sectors of the economy as well for Pakistan, especially. So natural gas has historically been an important source for fulfilling Pakistan's energy needs, primarily because the country used to have a natural endowment of the fuel, and it had an inherent cost advantage over oil. We've seen that the reliance on natural gas has only risen in these past few years. At present, it contributes almost 30% to the country's final consumption. And while a lot of this was being supplied through domestic natural gas in the past, domestic production peaked around 2008, and then we've just witnessed a decline in the domestic reserves of the country, and a decline in the production capacity. And the government did try to diversify its supply through, it tried to bring on different pipeline projects where it would be importing from other countries, but these projects haven't really come to fruition. So to plug the gas deficit in the short term, Pakistan started importing natural gas in liquefied form from 2015 onwards. And we've really seen Pakistan become a major buyer in the international market. At present, about 26% of the country's natural gas consumption is being met through imported LNG. And this is only projected to increase in the future. Experts speculate that this may go up to even 90% in the years to come. We can see how entrenched the need for LNG in Pakistan is. And LNG procurement has been happening through long-term contracts and spot market purchases, both of which have their own flaws. Spot market purchases is basically buying on the open market, and it contributes to about 40% of the imported LNG that is procured by the country. And we've seen that from the past 2 to 3 years, we've seen that LNG supplies have been facing huge constraints, which has led to supply shortages in the country, gas rationing, and in some cases, Pakistan really has been unable to procure supplies altogether, because we've seen defaults by term suppliers, the spot market, mainly because due to the supply crunch and the diversion of supply towards European markets and other influential Asian buyers like China, Japan, and Korea. Emerging economies are sort of left out of the mix when spot markets have prices that are as high as $40 per MMBTU or $60 per MMBTU. These prices are not really affordable for a country like Pakistan, so it has to forego supplies. And this results in, gas shortages for the domestic sector, for the industrial sector, power shortages as well, because a lot of our power generation is also dependent on LNG now. And what really happens is that the industry has started shifting towards unsustainable backup means. Like they've switched back to furnace oil. And the cost of power generation has also gone up, and fuel costs are passed through items. So these costs ultimately get passed on to the consumers. So we can see that it has broader macroeconomic impacts for the public and for the industry alike. I'll just give an example over here of the textile sector in one of the provinces of the country, which is majorly relying on LNG imports. This winter in December 2021, supplies were cut off to these industries for 15 days, but mainly because the procuring agencies were unable to secure supplies. So supplies were cut off, and that led to a revenue loss of about 20% of the textile industry's exports, which amounts to like $250 million. So that's a huge sum for an economy like Pakistan, which already has very meager exports. So we can really see that how reliance on on imported fuels like gas and building more gas infrastructure can really face jeopardy in the future due to we've seen how it has affected the economy. When we talk about infrastructure, it is impacting infrastructure as well. For example, one of the two LNG terminals in the country has been severely underutilized. It has only had an average utilization rate of 48% since 2015, and the government is paying capacity charges to these terminals for fuel that is not really utilized. So it has wider impacts on the economy and leads to financial burden for the country. Yeah, we can really see how problematic this entrenched reliance on gas has become for the country. And while better planning and management can ease these issues in the short term, I think for the longer term, emphasis should really be on renewable energy, because it's the best solution the country could have, as renewable energy has not only gotten very cost competitive as of late. It is an indigenous resource. It is free from geopolitical risks and market volatility. So I'll just stop here and hopefully we can take this discussion forward in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Many thanks, Hania. Very, very sobering, but also, of course, very informative presentation. If I understand this correctly, Pakistan basically now has a choice to either offset the price to consumers or to producers for the gas, which probably would also likely affect export revenues if they produced goods then change in cost, or to cut LNG supplies because you can't really afford this. I know we are not talking about this in detail today, but most probably the share of the fiscal budget that is being used for gas subsidies is very likely to grow if Pakistan continues betting on LNG dependency. So this is really looks like the country is stuck between a rock and a hard place. And I think World Bank Group would have a really powerful role in addressing this crisis. So maybe before jumping on to the next speaker, a very quick question to you. If you have any comment on what could the World Bank Group or other MDBs do in terms of very short-term support packages to help Pakistan out of this crisis?
The World Bank actually has supported renewable energy, especially wind energy projects in the past in the country. It has really helped with de-risking financing for these projects by offering concessionary finance. I think a similar approach can be applied to other supporting technologies that are necessary to counter the intermittent effect of renewable energy, such as battery storage, or promoting biogas in the country, which really could help with the supplementing natural gas, the domestic natural gas supplies of the country. So the World Bank could have a really positive role in de-risking financing for these technologies as well, and making sure that there is investor buy-in for these technologies, and making finance accessible for developers who want to venture into these investments. So I think similar, like the World Bank and the IFZ group did with wind energy, in addition to policy support, I think the World Bank could have a major role to play in providing accessible finance for these disruptive technologies, such as battery storage, such as pumped hydro storage, biogas, technologies which are supplementing variable renewable energy sources such as solar and wind all over the world. Yeah, thank you.
Makes a lot of thanks. Thanks a lot, Hania, and we'll come back to you in the Q&A session. But now let me present to you Victoria Ibisim Ohiri, who will present us some takeaways from a whole different economy. It's a producer economy, the role of gas and the role World Bank Group can play in helping this country shift. Victoria is a lawyer and a human rights activist. She is also the founder and director of research and policy at Spaces for Change, which is a nonprofit organization working to infuse human rights into social and economic governance processes in Nigeria. Victoria is a leading member of several international networks, such as Publish What You Pay, Global NPO Coalition, Experts Hub on Anti-Money Laundering and Counter-Finance of Terrorism, Security Policy Alternatives Networks, and many others. So, Victoria, the floor is yours. How does it look like in Nigeria, and yeah, what are your takes on the role of World Bank Group in all of this? Thanks.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Victoria. I'm joining in from Lagos, Nigeria. I listened to the last two presentations and just build on what some of the things they've said, with emphasis on some of their own experiences from Nigeria, which is, of course, an oil-dependent economy. So if COP26 is anything to go by, there seems to be a global consensus that is need to leapfrog to renewable energy. And what we're seeing is that there seems to be, what we're seeing is that the needs and priorities of different contexts is vary, regarding how, why, and when to transit to a green economy. And that lack of uniformity in the needs and priorities of different jurisdictions, I think, is informing huge gaps in policy and practice, especially at the national level. So I would just like give some examples from the Nigerian context. So Nigeria has joined many countries of the world to commit to achieving net zero. This commitment is contained in two major frameworks. We have the National Transition Plan that was unveiled in February 2022. This year, I also have a climate change law that was signed. It was passed late November last year. The National Transition Plan proposes a gas-based energy transition until 2040. And the reason behind this is that it will enable the country to launch the long-term renewable energy infrastructure procurement and make the necessary investment needed to have sustainable energy supply. The climate change law, on the other side, provides like a legal framework for facilitating the mobilization of finance and other resources necessary to ensure effective action on climate change and transiting effectively to a renewable energy future. But behind this commitment is throwing up a lot of issues. At the national level, stakeholders have been engaging the NTP, that's the National Transition Plan. So many issues are emerging. I will just summarize them into 5. The first is the availability and affordability of alternative cleaner fuels. The renewable energy resources abound in the country, wind, solar, all of that. But at the same time, the cost of producing energy from renewable energy resources remains high. The cost is still very, very, very high in the country. And it's raising question how many people can afford, the transition in the country, particularly if you're using World Bank statistics saying over about 60% of the population are still living in poverty. The second issue is availability of capital. The renewable energy production, where it's going on in the country is involving high operating costs and overheads, whether it's from the cost of connection, the cost of construction, cost of upgrading, transmission, distribution, the substations and the associated equipment. I think this is where the World Bank can intervene to support investments in investments in renewable energy production and scaling of existing initiatives. The third issue at the country level is the scale of losses that the country might experience in event of a transition to renewable energy. What that means is that how much does Nigeria actually make from oil and gas? How much will it make from renewable energy when oil is no more? So this entails a comparison of the country's oil revenues versus non-oil revenues, and also making projections for anticipated revenues from renewable energy. they weighed against actual earnings from crude oil. The third is the mathematics of energy security. Nigeria currently has a population of 200 million people, with over 40% of that number still unconnected to the national grid. And still, some of them, majority of them, still lacking any form of access to energy or electricity. So the question is, how much does it cost to electrify a nation of 200 million people with natural gas, which is the country's preferred transition fuel, versus the amount needed to provide energy for 200 million people with renewable energy resources? The question again is, this an area requiring World Bank intervention to provide bridge funding? And the last last issue is the new policy directions. And this will really focus on correcting some of the bad lessons learned from operating a fossil fuel economy. There's been lots and lots of challenges with the fossil fuel economy. And there are expectations that the just transition will depend on the development of coherent implementation strategies for building diversified and resilient economy in a post-oil era. It's not clear yet whether national authorities will eventually introduce legal regimes that will preserve governmental grip on renewable energy resources, because that is at the root of the current tensions. The central government retains a firm grip on fossil fuel revenues. And the question many people are asking, whether that will be preserved should the country transit to a green economy with attendant centralized resource governance and management systems. There are also other concerns. Recently, Resources for Change conducted a research trying to find out what communities, extractive communities in the oil and gas producing regions, what do they think about transition to a green economy? And we found out across the globe that a lot of research hasn't really focused on what is happening or the perspectives of people living in those extractive resource extraction zones. The first thing that I would mention is that energy transition discourse in Nigeria and also in many other places seems to be happening a lot upstream, which means that the issues are formulated and propagated by various elite groups in the government, in the corporate and international circles, with little scope for integrating the priorities of communities whose livelihoods are now dependent or even intertwined with extraction and production of fossil fuels. So that research finding showed us three clear demands from communities. The first is there is a clamor for restorative justice. So the clamor for environmental justice is now increasingly intertwined with the demand for climate justice. So this emphasizes the importance of restoring areas damaged by decades of oil and gas extraction to their previous conditions as a precondition for transiting to a renewable energy. The country is not just supposed to allow corporations that have devastated the environment, destroyed the local vegetation, to just leave and, without repairing the damage that they have done. So for people in these communities, they want the local farmlands returned to a fertile, farmable state post-oil, and a return to environmental sustainability that can support traditional livelihoods. There's also the question of affordability and accessibility, which I think I've mentioned before, that the kind of energy that low-income people use, especially LPG and solar, is still unaffordable, largely unaffordable to most low-income households. And the last part, which I think I mentioned before, is has been a clamor, which we call in local context, we call it clamor for resource control, which is speaking to, which is like an agitation against centralized control of resources from energy. So there is a clamor at the community level whether a green economy would promise and deliver local ownership of these resources, as opposed to corporate control of such resources, accompanied by token distribution of handouts called social risk, corporate responsibility. So the final thing I would like to mention is how the needs of different jurisdictions is causing policy inconsistencies especially in the Nigerian context. So recently, Nigeria passed what we call the Petroleum Industry Law, which is an omnibus legislation governing all aspects of the petroleum industry. So why the government has made ambitious plans to transit to renewable energy. At the same time, the new petroleum industry law makes a lot of robust plans to boost crude oil reserves and increase national production capacities. So there is a provision in the new law that requires at least 30% of profit oil and gas should be devoted to production or expanding to frontier exploration development. And the second inconsistency we're seeing is, I think, also similar to what is happening in Pakistan, the dependency on imported fuels, which has made it impossible for the country to eradicate fossil fuel subsidies. What happens is that whenever the government removes fossil fuels, the fossil fuel subsidies, it forces retail prices of oil to go up. And once oil prices go up, it affects all supply chains for goods and services. Such astronomical price increases they cost public uprisings, they cost bad ratings for the government, and the government does not want the uprising. They don't want to deal with riots and protests. So what the government has been doing is that continues to shift the goalposts regarding when to end fossil fuel subsidies. So advocates, critics in the country, they are saying that fossil fuel subsidies can only end when local refineries are working. That's the only way to reduce dependency on imported refined fuels. Industries in the country are relying on natural gas to bridge the energy supply gaps caused by this dependency. So for energy transition, there are concerns. The major concern locally is energy dependence should be totally avoided in a post-oil future. Citizens want assurances that renewable energy will not introduce these dependencies on other countries for domestic energy supplies. So in conclusion, I would say that no doubt renewable energy is the way to go. But from all the trends I've discussed, whether it's from the community issues, the revenue concerns, the accessibility and affordability challenges, what is showing is that natural gas is playing a very important role in the Nigerian economy, especially for meeting energy supply challenges. But at the same time, the trends they further accentuate the imperative for meaningful engagement between the World Bank and oil-dependent economies like Nigeria to address these concerns at multiple levels. So I'll stop here and answer some questions.
Many thanks. Fascinating insights. From what I take from your presentation is that there is indeed a high demand for some transition mechanisms that have to be put in place, although probably it is to a large extent the responsibility of the big oil companies to clean up their act after financing the oil and gas production in the country, and also invest in basically revivifying the area and making sure just transition for the workers happens. But before I open the floor for the questions from the audience, I was wondering a question basically to you and also to the previous speakers. Looking back at the multilateral financing institutions, in particular World Bank Group institutions, if there were one thing you'd say the World Bank Group needs to change most urgently in their approach to how they finance energy, what would that be from the local context, from Nigeria's perspective? Hani, of course, from the perspective of Pakistan, Bronwyn, if you have any remarks on this, that would be excellent. And then let's open the floor to the participants.
So should I start first? Great. Yeah, so what would that be for the World Bank? I think I mentioned most of them. The president also re-echoed some of those appeals at COP26 after he announced the government's commitment to net zero. He applied for financing to help Nigeria meet some of the renewable energy targets that it has set for it, especially between now and 2040. And why that financing is important is that critical renewable energy infrastructure is grossly lacking in the country. And even people that are using renewable energy, they still have to supplement that with other fuels, especially the natural gas powered generators, which is very popular in the country. So the World Bank can come in form of investment in critical renewable energy infrastructure in the country. Another way is also through private sector. The private sector has done a lot in supporting investments, in helping the country to scale up renewable energy production. And some independent generated energy has also been, some of them, I think when it reaches a particular capacity, they're not connected to the national grid. And not just direct financing to government, direct financing to private sector can also help to bridge that gap. And I think finally, one thing that is very important is bringing prices of renewable energy products down, especially those used by the poor. So one critical area of financing is LPG. LPG is important because it's used by women in particular, and is also used, there's a lot of campaign in the country for women to transit to the use of LPG. And that campaign is really gaining momentum. So in order not to roll back on the gains that the country has made, direct financing to increase the use of LPG for women is another critical area of intervention that the World Bank can consider.
Thanks, Victoria. Hania, do you have any takeaways, any insights on this?
So if I were just to suggest something for this, I think it would be the fact that the World Bank needs to increase transparency in its lending practices. We can see that the World Bank does most of its lending. The World Bank and other MDBs as well, they do most of their lending through policy-based lending, which is really a blanket term, and the country is free to use the loans or the financial support for any projects that they want to. So like it is not really defined that lending should go towards greener and cleaner development projects. So I think there is really a big need. There's a big gap that exists in there, that transparency around these lending practices needs to increase. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank just recently came up with its draft energy strategy, and it really lists, it's a very good example of how lending should be. It really lists down the kind of projects that it will provide financing for. So for example, for gas projects, it really says that it will only fund gas projects which are displacing more carbon intensive fuels like oil and coal. And then similarly, it has many categories for greener financing for renewable energy projects. And it has certain conditions under which it will be supporting fossil fuel-based investments, and it is really following an approach that phases out financing for such fuels. So I think something of this sort, we need to be sure where the money that the World Bank provides will be going towards. Yeah, because in the past we've seen in Pakistan that some of the policy lending has made its way towards fossil fuel-based projects as well. Yeah.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. Bronwyn.
Yeah, so hopefully this isn't a cop-out, but I think just really sort of shifting finance from the remaining finance to fossil fuels to renewable energy. And I think basically that needs to be project finance, but also in terms of how they approach this policy-based lending, and in terms of where solutions are most needed and where the World Bank can play the most catalytic role. I think really the kind of distributed renewable energy that's been identified as most often the kind of most effective for reaching energy access. We know that those solutions have just been really underfunded across the board, and the World Bank has a really a big potential to step in and really play a catalytic role there to ensure kind of universal energy access is reached.
Thanks, Bremen. While you're on hold, I'd maybe shoot a couple more questions as you that are in the chat. And one of them from Franwood on what would you say about the risk that while developed and middle income countries can actually afford to transition from coal-based energy system to renewable-based model, the developing countries, particularly many countries in Africa, that are facing energy poverty in relation to post-COVID recovery and due to the global energy crisis are not in this position. What would you say?
Yeah, so I think here, kind of first and foremost, is that wealthy countries in the global north need to move first and fastest on this. And so that's both in phasing out fossil fuel production, but it also means paying their fair share for the global energy transition. And so in relation to the World Bank, that means there's a real responsibility of shareholders as well to increase their financing and also increase it in a way that is not creating new unsustainable debts, that is actually has more granting components and is able to support a transition in a way that is actually pro-public and not putting people in, not privatizing energy. Oh, I might stop video just seeing that froze, so hopefully my sound is okay. So yeah, there's just a huge responsibility of wealthy countries to actually meet their climate finance goals and then greatly exceed those, because we know that they're not actually in line with historic responsibility. But in terms of really we can also look at the risks of kind of doubling down on fossil fuels at this moment and across the board really see, for energy access that renewable solutions are almost always the most effective and affordable. We can look at the effect of fossil fuel finance also crowding out more affordable renewable energy solutions in many cases. We can look at the kind of like job creation impacts of a fossil fuel system versus a renewable one, and also see more jobs created with renewables. And so I think those benefits are already long-standing. And then looking at a moment where we just are, fossil fuel markets are increasingly volatile, that kind of holds in energy models going forward. And the risk of stranded assets is only growing. And so we've seen this really directly in a ton of World Bank case studies, even of either development policy recommendations or direct finance that creates really big risks of stranded assets, and also structures contracts in a way where fossil fuel development and power purchase agreements are really favored towards a company, often companies that are multinational corporations that are based in the global north. And so that's really who receives the benefits from kind of doubling down on fossil fuels rather than through jobs, energy access, or even really strong public revenues. And so I think there's also, it's wealthy countries definitely need to be increasing finance, and that needs to be the priority. But even in the kind of absence of that, there's huge risks to kind of doubling down on a fossil fuel pathway. I'll stop there.
Thanks. Yeah, that makes total sense. And maybe to add to comment on volatility of fossil fuel markets, I think we are now facing a very much non-volatile gas market where we probably can expect with rather high certainty, very high prices and rather tight supply, at least for the next 5 to 7 years, really irrespective of new investments in this sector or not. So this is really becomes more of an urgency for the countries who are dependent on coal-based economies or who are working on based on coal-based energy systems to urgently consider measures to leapfrog and skip basically gas in their transitions, which is of course much more challenging for countries that are already locked in lots of gas consumption, such as Pakistan or Nigeria, for example. I have just learned that Tanya unfortunately has to leave us in a couple of minutes, and I wanted to usurp my position as a moderator, ask her one last question before she leaves. We have been now talking quite a lot about what World Bank can do to shift this financing away from fossil fuels and how many more benefits it would create to really not focus on gas, but focus on other energy supply. I was wondering whether you had any comments on what role World Bank can play in addressing the energy demand in the developing countries that are now maybe in more need than ever to really keep the demand, which is growing in the developing countries in particular, keep the demand in check, whether solutions such as energy efficiency, boosting the flexibility of the power grids and the energy system altogether, whether this is something you see as an area where multilateral development institutions and World Bank Group in particular can play a role, and if yes, then what this role would look like.
Definitely. I think that's one of the major things that we've been trying to highlight in our work as well, that energy efficiency and demand side management really needs to be really needs to come to the forefront to manage this energy crisis that we're facing. And of course, the World Bank, because it does have a certain role to play in this sector as well, because it has it can directly influence governments' decisions and policy making. And it really has a very good technical assistance team, so it can take care of the lack of technical capacity and capacity building issues that exist within the current government institutions within the country in this regard, and really close that gap that that will provide workable solutions for incorporating energy efficiency into energy planning within the country's planning processes. We've seen in the case of Pakistan, we've seen that energy efficiency and demand side management are not really a process when it comes to planning for future capacity additions. So the World Bank has been heavily involved in providing technical assistance to government entities which are undertaking these planning processes within the country. So I think it really, the bank really has clout over there, that it can make sure that energy efficiency is mainstreamed in the planning processes. And then on the consumer side, policies and incentives are provided to the consumers that they invest in more energy efficient appliances, and that demand side management is also taking place in the country.
Many thanks, Hania, for excellent remarks. And thanks again for the presentation and being with us up until now. I have a hand from Elaine Zuckerman. Elaine, if you'd like to come up and maybe present yourself very quickly, and then your question.
Thanks. I'm Elaine Zuckerman of Gender Action. I'm sorry to arrive very late, but Maninder asked for a meeting at 8 o'clock, same time as this meeting. So I hope I'm not repeating something other people said, but I joined in the middle of Victoria's remarks, and I wanted to share a very contrary experience view that I had looking at Nigerian World Bank financed gas in Nigeria. A few years ago, Gender Action, together with our partner in Nigeria, which was Equal Rights Action, the Friends of the Earth affiliate in Nigeria, we visited a number of sites on the World Bank financed West Africa gas pipelines, which covered 3 or 4 countries, but Nigeria was the biggest country in the center of the production. The sites we visited, the communities we visited, were totally devastated by the World Bank Group financed West Africa gas pipelines. Previously, the fishers, as they call them, were women, by and large. They totally lost their livelihoods, they lost their homes. The land and the sea were so dead and so destroyed in these villages along the coast when you moved up and down from Port Harcourt, where we started our journey, where the World Bank Finance Project took place, that not even a fly could survive. I mean, nothing could possibly survive. I've never seen such dead land and sea anywhere. On top of that, there was militarization. So the project had these goons in camouflage with rifles everywhere, telling us that we shouldn't look anywhere. It was actually quite scary. But the point is that all the communities we talked to where the project took place were just completely devastated. So to hear that women want to use LNG, well, maybe you heard that from some communities, but we saw a very contrary picture in Nigeria that I wanted to share with you. And Bronwyn had mentioned that multilaterals gain, and indeed we saw Shell, which was involved in the project, quite visibly there. So I totally agree with her and my other colleagues that, hey, the way to go is fossil fuels. Stop all of this destructive, extractive fossil fuel investing. Thanks.
Thanks, Elaine. I just realized that we have actually quite a big cloud of participants that can share many more lessons learned from the experiences on the ground. I was wondering, Victoria, if you would like to quickly respond to that.
Yeah, I didn't see, because she started by saying she has a contrary view. I didn't actually see a contrary view. I actually saw her reinforcing some of the demands from the communities, the demand especially for restorative justice. That demand is live and real across most extractive communities in Nigeria, including those hosting gas pipelines. I also did mention that communities were demanding for not just restoring taking it back to what it was so that they can return back. Before oil, most of those areas were agrarian communities. Communities depended a lot on both commercial, on subsistence farming. And they are communities where we did the research. One of them is on Hajigbema, which is known for their species of yams. They had the most nutritious species of yam in the country. And they specifically wanted to go back to agriculture and said oil companies must not leave the country without returning the environment to the state in which it was. So Elaine, I think Elaine really re-echoed some of the demands from the communities, which I also shared during my presentation. And the other demand is for, even when we call on the World Bank to, okay, sorry, before I get to that, what I talked about is LPG, not LNG. LPG is a liquefied petroleum gas, which is what used for cooking, not the LNG that is used for electricity and firing up industrial equipment. So there are different things. In Nigeria, how energy is used in Nigeria is different from how it's used in Europe. For instance, there is no need to use gas for heating in houses. There's no house in the country that uses gas for heating. So people use gas mainly for electricity generation and for powering heavy industrial equipment. So the people mainly relying on like natural gas plants are companies and industries, heavy industries. So as we're having volatility of gas prices across the country is increasing the cost of production in the country and, causing a lot of shocks and disruptions in supply chains that we're seeing. Going back to the last point I wanted to make, which is on bridging inequality. There's a lot of call on the World Bank to maybe assist in providing financing. I agree with the last speaker for transparent lending practices. And what does transparent lending practices mean for a country like Nigeria? It means that their support for renewable energy or their lending practices must take into account some of these realities on the ground. The reality of environmental devastation, the reality of inequality in access to renewable energy products and services. So these are some of the ways that the World Bank can also make things easier for developing economies.
Many thanks, Victoria. We have a couple more minutes for a couple more questions, which are partly in the chat. And if somebody else would like to raise his or her hand or has some final question, please do so, because we don't have much time left. But first, let me get back to the question by George, who posed a question to Bronwyn. I think it is fair to also ask Victoria to comment on this if she would like to. on how the World Bank, IMF, and the governments can financially support the scaling up of the production of electric vehicles for accessibility to all countries. This probably is less directly related to the gas question, because this probably would lead to reduction of oil demand. But nevertheless, this is, I think, a very important topic. So, Bronwyn, if you'd like to address this.
Yeah, for sure. I can start, and then yeah, definitely Victoria, if you have pieces to add. Yeah, I would say in terms of looking at public banks' roles in general, I think where they can be most impactful is really looking at where there's that kind of like underlying infrastructure often that needs to be supported, that can really enable other projects and finance to come after that. And so for electric vehicles, I think it's a lot of that kind of like charging infrastructure that would be really helpful, or kind of most impactful. And then I would also say for transportation, it's also looking at, you know, how we can actually really meaningfully serve people's mobility needs. And I think looking at both climate impacts, but also just quality of life and actually being able to kind of serve large populations. I really think the kind of priority, even over kind of individual electric vehicles, is really also investments in public transit as an infrastructure system, and also making sure that that public transit is you know, affordable, ideally free to use, so that it is really, and also that it's, you know, built on strong networks, so that it is actually really you know, the preferable mode of transportation. And we see kind of like across climate models that really systemic shift to really strong and affordable public transit is, you know, across the board. I think this is true in every country. That's really the kind of transportation solution that I think the World Bank and other banks across the board should be prioritizing.
Many thanks, Bronwyn. There is one more question in the chat, and I'm really happy that people are asking about, so what can World Bank do to really make a positive change? And I think the other challenge that, to be fair, is going to stay with us as well is the role of well, let me find the question. Here we go. Is basically the need to infuse human rights in our trade policy agenda. I would say also in the energy policy agenda. And when we're talking about, you know, massive shift to renewables energy, we also need to think about the greening of the overall supply chains. Well, I very much agree with Carlo. Or Carlo, I see you have your hand raised. Would you like to come in and ask the question yourself?
Oh, you're doing a beautiful job. I defer to you completely. Thank you very much.
All right. Anyway, so this challenge of really the need to green the supply chains altogether is a top priority, and we also see that the countries with a constrained fiscal space, with low economic capacity, will struggle doing that. And is there a role the World Bank and other MDBs can play, and what is the role you see for the private sector there? How should it shift? Would somebody like to take this?
Yeah, it's not just the World Bank. The World Bank has a lot of role to play, but I think the World Bank would do that together with the host governments of various countries. Most developing economies that are rich in mineral resources, they're having what they're called the resource costs. So what that resource cost actually means is that fossil fuels, so to speak, that minerals, resources the continent has had, has not trickled down to people who live in those localities, especially where those resources are extracted from. So I think a lot of financing do not pay attention to how finance also bridges inequality and further excludes people who should benefit from these resources. So I know that sometimes conditionalities are included in those transactions to make countries more alive to the obligations. So some of those conditionalities are requiring that there should be grievance mechanisms. Ellen talked about World Bank finance pipelines causing devastation in communities. And those communities lack grievance mechanisms to be able to channel, to seek redress, basically. Access to remedies, not just by the countries, but by those providing the finance, which is the World Bank, should be made available to communities. That is one of the ways of bridging inequality, and that is one area that financing has fallen short. Financing, not just from the World Bank, from different types of international institutions. The finance that they have provided have been used to violate human rights monumentally in different parts of the country. So ensuring that their finance is not used to continue to perpetuate those injustices is one way to go.
And of course, the inspection panel has been working on some of those issues, I'm sure. Maybe more communication from their perspective.
Yes, that is true, but the question is how accessible those panels are to people living in remote communities. I know a lot of people. I worked with CERAC, and CERAC used the World Bank Inspection Panel to push back on eviction. I think that was in the early 2000s in Lagos. And because CERAC is also an elite organization, so we're talking about communities in the resource extraction zones that do not know, do not have a lot of information, do not know how to assess and how to use these mechanisms to seek legal redress.
Thank you for empowering those voices.
Many thanks, Carla and Victoria, for addressing this important issue. I don't have any more questions in the chat, so I would ask Bronwyn, you and Victoria to offer any final remarks if you have any. And then maybe we'll try to sum up the dynamic discussion we were having for the last hour and a half before closing. Bro, would you like to go first?
Sure. Yeah. In terms of, looking just on this topic, I think I've talked about the need, to shift the World Bank's fossil fuel finance to these kind of transformative climate solutions already. But I think really just to stress that I think this is kind of the bare minimum. It's really like the the need to stop kind of directly undermining human rights and climate action and all of these issues that are made worse by fossil fuels, but that there is a real opportunity. Climate change will impact everything, and because of that, a kind of just energy transition and a transition that will see us have a livable future is also an opportunity to really rethink and restructure how we do a lot of things. And so, in that transition to renewable energy, where just by nature, there are more small scale facilities and less environmental impacts, we definitely need human rights and kind of pro-public ownership models to have kind of a successful transition that doesn't leave workers and communities behind. But there are, just because of some of those kind of core characteristics of renewable energy and then going outside the energy sector, I think that kind of pattern is seen in a lot of different kind of climate solutions, where there really is this opportunity to not just avoid the worst impacts of climate change, but also really restructure and reimagine society in a way that really prioritizes public goods and redistributes resources in a way where everyone can live a good life. Yeah, and thanks so much, everyone, for coming today.
Thanks,
Yes,
Bronwyn. Victoria, go ahead.
Yeah, so the last, maybe my closing thought would be that the fears of massive revenue losses that will arise from the funding fossil fuels, those fears are well-founded. Concerns by communities about corporations leaving their, their installations and the damage that they've done are returning back to their countries. Those concerns are also very legitimate. I think that the energy transition discourse should take into account all of these, the constant debates at multiple levels, especially at the local levels. Many of these people at the local level do not have access to important platforms like this where they can speak for themselves. And it's important that we take into account all the peculiarities of the different contexts, the needs and priorities of different jurisdictions, and ensure that they are mainstreamed in global energy transition plans.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Victoria. So I now have a challenge to sum up the discussions we're having in 3 minutes. I will try to do so. So we've taken a look at where the public finance in energy goes, and taking a closer look at the World Bank Group in Bronwyn's presentation, and then went through some of the impacts of fossil fuel finance and underfinancing and in the critical infrastructure underlying renewable energy deployment and the renewable energy solutions in developing countries, Pakistan and Nigeria. We have discussed we have discussed ways of how World Bank Group can change its approach to energy financing and what are the critical areas for World Bank to really think through and revisit in their energy and climate policies. We have heard a lot about the need to increase the transparency of lending policies and introduce new assessments mechanisms that can meaningfully determine what good looks like in energy finance and really restrict any unhelpful and harming fossil fuel finance in developing countries. We have discussed the need to introduce financing practices for transition mechanisms for the communities involved, particularly in oil and gas production on the ground. This is very evident in the case of Nigeria, but also in many other producing countries. We have touched upon the need to really nuance the financing when it comes to gas, because the finance of large-scale LNG infrastructure that locks in country in gas use and production for years and exposes us to the problems that Pakistan, for example, now faces. And financing LPG, that is one of the quickest ways to empower women in the rural areas and get closer to closing the gap on energy access in developing countries, are two different things. And they also need to be considered as such by the finance policies of the World Bank Group. We have also touched upon the need of the multilateral development banks and World Bank Group institutions in particular to use their political clout with the governments, because they have been involved quite a lot in the technical assistance and have in an indirect way co-shaped the policies that governments now have that determine the government's approach to energy finance. The same card can be really used to make a positive change in the policy frameworks and put the frameworks in place that can unlock further investments in renewable energy. And then finally, we also touched upon the need to green the supply chains and the role the bank could play to help avoid another spiral of the resource curves for countries that are rich in resources that will be critical for the transition to renewables-based energy system. This even goes beyond the energy policy, I think, and beyond energy finance, but that also shows how systemic a challenge of shift to renewables is, and how much more effort needs to be put into the shift of the policies of development financing institutions. Finally, what has been noted several times, and I have already highlighted in the beginning, it is really important to engage with the communities on the ground and with the broader civil society, going ahead with the revision of energy policies and reshaping the approach to energy finance. Today we had but a glimpse actually of what impacts fossil fuel finance can have on the communities. We had just two inputs from two countries, and I'm sure among the participants in this room there are experiences from many more regions, many more countries. And that's exactly what makes the engagement with the civil society and with the groups on the ground so meaningful and so important. Regretfully, we couldn't have a direct exchange with the World Bank Group speakers today, but we really hope to follow up with them in a meaningful way on all these issues around gas and fossil fuel finance, and on shifting investments to clean energy solutions and enabling this truly systemic shift towards renewables-based economies for the developing countries. I thank you all very much for participating in this webinar. My particular thanks go to the speakers, Bronwyn and Victoria. Thanks a lot for your excellent remarks. And yes, hope to see you all soon in one of other webinars of the Civil Society Policy Forum that is still ongoing ahead of the spring meetings. Thanks a lot.